Hey, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. Um, just going to give some folks a few seconds here to get connected. You'll notice that I don't have an additional person with me tonight. I'm going to be your speaker. So we're going to get started here in just a few minutes talking about water quality for beef cattle. So really excited to talk about that. It's something a little bit different than what I typically cover. So we'll get that started here in just a minute. Thank you for joining us for this whole series. We really appreciate the feedback that we've gotten from you all and are happy to provide these webinars so that folks can participate either live from home, live from a county office, or even watching the on-demand recordings. So just as a reminder, and you've heard it several times already from us, but the survey at the end does not count as your attendance, but we certainly love to hear your feedback. So if you're able to take that survey after the webinar is over, we would appreciate that. But your attendance is counted by just being here tonight live or by watching the recording. So really appreciate everybody sticking with us over the past couple of weeks. We've just got this webinar and then 2 more next week, and that will conclude our fall series. It seemed like it went by pretty quick, but I'm glad that everybody was able to be here for the ones that we've had so far. So I'm going to go ahead and get my presentation pulled up while we wait, and then we'll get started. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into this. Water quality for beef cattle. Like I said, it's a little bit different than a topic that I would typically cover, which would be some sort of nutrition or feeding topic or even forages. But I've really become interested in this water quality question, specifically as it relates to pond water and environmental protection of those ponds, or just protection of our soil and water resources as they are. And also how that quality affects cattle performance. And so tonight we're going to start out by talking about some nutritional aspects of water, or quality aspects of water, and why they're important and why they might affect cattle production. And then we're going to transition into some of the environmental benefits of having good water quality or good water management, and how that all relates together on our beef farms. So we'll go ahead and make sure I can get my slides going. Here we go. So just to start out with the very basic concept that water is the basis of life, right? So when it comes to nutrition for cattle, when we jump in and start thinking about intake and dry matter and energy and forages, we often forget about water being one of the 6 basic nutrients. And that's because I think we kind of take it for granted in our diets and also in cattle diets. And so we just have to remember that it's critical for every single physiological process that's happening in the body. And even down to the tiniest, mechanisms or whatever metabolic processes are going on. And so if we don't provide water and we don't provide quality water, then we can sacrifice growth of our growing animals, our calves, or our developing heifers, thinking about reproduction and specifically lactation. So that lactation requirement has a really big pull of water, obviously, to create milk. And if a cow is not receiving enough water to support that, then that's going to in turn affect her lactation ability and also her calf's performance. It also helps with excretion. So we know that nutrients have to move through the body and have to be, some of that has to be excreted as waste. And if an animal is dehydrated and it's not able to get rid of that waste as easily, that starts to kind of back up some of those nutrients or fiber and starts to create a negative effect on that animal. Another big important one is evaporation or cooling. So being able to cool the body when it's hot certainly in those summer months or when they're directly in the sun, being able to cool the body so that, they don't get overheated during that time. Water affects, nutrient use and mineral balance and pH buffering. So all those parts and pieces that go into the bloodstream, and how nutrients are broken down in the rumen and how they're absorbed and transferred. Again, all of those little metabolic processes cannot take place without the help of water driving them. So it really just is critical for a great deal of life, right? And all of the things that go into nutrition. So what about intake levels? It's a little bit difficult for us to say exactly how much a cow's going to drink or a calf is going to drink, because it really depends on what the environment is like and what the stage of that animal is. So if we think about in the summer months, we tend to drink more liquid than we do in the winter when we're working outside, especially. And so if it's really hot out, cattle are going to drink a lot more than when it's cool. If it's humid and they're, that evaporation or that cooling is a little bit harder, they may drink more. And then not only the environmental temperature, but also the water temperature. When you're working in the summer, you certainly don't want to take a glass of hot water and drink it. You want to have something that's cool, that cools your body down. And so as water gets too warm for cattle, they tend to not want to drink it as much as when it's cool. I mentioned milk production, that water really influences that level of lactation. And so if a cow is milking pretty heavy, she's going to need more water and hopefully take in more water if she has access to it so that she can meet that requirement. And then same with her pregnancy status. That process of growing a calf is going to require additional input from her body. Physical activity, cattle that are, up and having to move around a lot in, specifically we're thinking about working cattle when we're working them, and especially if it's hot or we've gotten them up and they're have a lot of activity associated with whatever we're doing. That can make them tired. They're going to go and want to drink after that activity takes place. And then just kind of the rest of the list here, growth rate, animal size, of course, how quickly they're growing and how big they are will influence their intake. And then we're also going to talk about diet type and moisture level. So they can get water from the forages that they eat, but, that can be different based on whether they're grazing fresh pasture or if they are consuming hay. And then salt intake is a big one. So when we provide mineral and it's mixed with salt, or we provide salt, just plain white salt, there's going to be a balance there between them consuming salt and then turning around and consuming water, kind of back and forth. And so that really affects how much they're going to need access to. So this table just shows some pretty general requirements. I mean, it's, we're certainly not going to go out and measure gallons of water for an animal, right? But it just really gives you a good understanding of not only the difference from a small animal, so a 500-pound calf, up to a large animal, an 1,100-pound cow. And then, of course, the temperature range as well. So if we're looking at 40 degrees, thinking about last week, how cold it was across a lot of Tennessee, that our animals are not going to drink as much during the day. But when we get to the summer months, we see these numbers nearly double for all of these classes or stages of animal based on that temperature change. And so being able to anticipate that and understand that depending on what the level of accessibility of our water is, and knowing if we're going to need to provide more in the summer, if we have kind of a limited resource, so like a pond, or if we have water that is more readily available, and we can adjust from there. So I mentioned that feed can be a water source. Whenever we think about cattle grazing, they're grazing lush forage, and that forage typically is 75 or 80% water. And so if they're on a fresh pasture, they're probably not going to consume as much water as they would if they're in a dry lot setting or a backgrounder setting where they're, pinned up and they're eating a pretty dry diet. Then they're going to need to offset that with some additional water intake. And then there's also what we call metabolic water. So when feed or forage is digested and metabolized by the animal, the oxidation of the energy in that forage or feed results in water production, just part of that metabolic process. And so they can create some water in the body just by consuming feed and breaking it down, essentially. But these are, things that we don't want to rely on as a water source. We know that they contribute to water intake. And especially, again, if they're grazing fresh pasture, they're getting a lot of their water that way. But we always want to still provide clean, accessible water to cattle, regardless of their diet, just to make sure that they have the opportunity to drink and make up for any water that they're not getting from their feed. So what are some of the water quality concerns that we think about, or some of the parameters that we might measure or look at when it comes to water quality? And these are not specific to livestock or beef cattle. They're specific to just water quality in general. So safe drinking water for us is similar to safe drinking water for cattle. And there are a lot of different ways that we can assess that quality. If you're on municipal water, you can pull a report typically from your water company, utility company, and they'll give you some of these numbers just so you're aware of what that water quality is. If you have a well and you've had to test that well, you know that some of these parameters are tested that way too. So it's just always important to know what that water quality is for us, but also, for our livestock, because they can have an effect on performance and intake. So I've got the kind of the full list here. We're not going to go into all of these, but biological hazards or concerns would be things like bacteria, viruses, protozoa, and parasite eggs that can be found in water. And we're specifically thinking about especially ponds here. So where cattle have spent time loafing in the pond and there's excrement associated with that. And if they have the opportunity to stand in the pond or drink from the pond after that bacteria or virus has gotten into the water or protozoa, then that's where they can really pick up some disease and cause some negative impacts. As far as physical quality goes, color, turbidity, sediment, temperature, odor, and algae. So things that would directly affect palatability or desirability of that water. If somebody hands you a glass of muddy water with a lot of sediment in it, you're probably not going to want to drink it if it has an off smell. If your water smells like sulfur, it's less appealing for us to want to consume something like that. And cattle can pick up on some of that as well. Now they do drink out of a pond, right? That we wouldn't typically drink out of, but it is a different palatability. Certainly if they have the option, they're probably going to go to clean water first. And so just some physical characteristics that we think about when it comes to water quality. And then finally, chemical. So these are aspects that we can't see directly and may not have an influence necessarily on palatability as immediately as a physical concern would. But these are things that we need to think about, especially nitrates and how they impact cattle and can potentially cause death or harm in cattle. And when they're combined with a feedstuff that has high nitrates, that can really become problematic. So some of these chemical properties, they have to be tested for, obviously, in a lab, but just understanding the ranges and knowing when it's safe and when it's not to utilize water that has high levels of some of these different substances. So we're going to break down a few of these just a little bit more. The first one is temperature. So one of those physical characteristics. And, like I mentioned, when we're out working in the summer and we're hot and we want a cool drink, somebody hands you a a water bottle and it feels like bath water if it's been sitting in the truck or whatever, you might drink it, but it's not as refreshing as having a cool glass of water or something with ice in it. And so if they do have access to cool water, that's going to increase their water and feed intake and also help them to regulate their body temperature. So we have to remember that cattle create a lot of heat with their digestion or their fermentation within the rumen. And so especially in the summer when it's hot and their body is creating heat, the ability to drink cool water to cool down that rumen can really help to dissipate some of that heat from inside. And so if you have a water source that's deep, and especially if it's groundwater, naturally it's going to be cooler than either a shallow pond or a shallow trough, especially thinking about a water trough like I have pictured here. When it's a bright sunny day and the water is really being directly hit by the sun and absorbing that heat, it doesn't take it long to heat up. And if it's a shallow tank, then that water is going to stay warm and get warm quicker than if it were something that were deeper. And so just thinking about that as a palatability issue, really, and just it doesn't encourage them to drink as much to be able to cool down if that water is too hot. All right, pH. So this is a measure of alkalinity or acidity. If you're familiar with the pH scale, it's from 1 to 14, and everything below 7 is acidic, and everything above 7 is alkaline or basic. And that pH of 7 is neutral, and that's what our body thrives on. That's what cattle, their blood system and their body thrives on as well. And so the acceptable range for pH is going to be between 6.5 and 8. There's not a lot of research that shows that cattle tend to drink, one pH level of water over the other because it's hard to create those conditions. But we know that if water is too acidic and it contributes to the acid in the rumen, which is already being built up from digestion, then it can contribute to acidosis. And if that water is excessively alkaline or basic, then it can cause some digestive problems and laxative effect. And so this pH is something that, is pretty simple in terms of how we interpret that number. It's either acidic or it's alkaline. But if it gets too extreme in one of those directions, then it can cause some issues. All right, water hardness. So this is a buildup of minerals in the water. If you have hard water at home, you know that this can build up in your pipes. And so you see that residue here in this picture of buildup over a lot of time. And so not only is this a problem because it influences water delivery. So if you have hard water going through pipes or water fixtures into a trough and the buildup is like this, then that water flow is going to be reduced. And so it takes a lot longer to fill a trough, or it takes a lot longer for it to replenish as cattle drink out of it. And so can just create a kind of a delivery issue, first of all. And then also if the water has a lot of magnesium and calcium, if you've seen a mineral presentation and you've seen that mineral wheel where there's a circle with all of the minerals and then there's a bunch of lines, they look like strings all connecting each other, that tell us that one mineral's concentration can influence another's or influence its absorption. And so you can imagine if there are certain levels of magnesium and calcium in the water, that they could affect mineral absorption overall and make it a little bit more difficult for that animal to utilize mineral in their diet. All right, nitrates and nitrites. So just as a reminder, what I said earlier, nitrates are something that we think about in forages as well. Specifically this summer, we had a lot of concerns with nitrates in forage that had been fertilized, and then the drought came and those plants quit growing and the nitrates built up. And if folks were harvesting forage during that time, those nitrates are accumulated in the plant and they don't dissipate or they don't go away. And so depending on what the level of that nitrate is in the feed itself will determine whether or not that feed is safe to use. And then if you come in with water that might have high nitrate levels and you combine those, then you're going to get an overall increase in nitrates or nitrites in the diet. And so it's important to remember that there are guidelines for both the water concentration of nitrates and the feed concentration of nitrates. And if you have both, to make sure that you account for both in the diet. And so just as a reminder of what nitrate does, when it's consumed, that nitrate accumulates in the rumen. It's not broken down as quickly because there's just a buildup. There's a lot more in the rumen than there typically would be. And essentially it causes issues with oxygen transport. And so when an animal is affected by high nitrate, essentially what happens is it asphyxiates. So it's not able to get oxygen through its bloodstream, and it suffocates or asphyxiates because it's not getting that oxygen. And so nitrate poisoning or death from nitrates is something that we can't see the symptoms of. We typically just see the resulting death of that because it's not something that you're visibly going to be able to see them, their blood changing or not being able to transport oxygen. And so there are some levels here that, again, similar to what we would see on a guideline for feeding cattle, feeds with nitrates in them. There are low levels here that are going to be safe with no restrictions. And then as you increase that level, you see that it starts to become a little bit more tricky. So safe when offered with feeds that are low in nitrates, if consumed for a long time, they could be harmful. And then as you get up into the really high levels, they become more likely to cause death or even completely unsafe for use. And so those levels, as they build up, become more unsafe. And it's just important to remember that there can be multiple sources, both the feed and the water, that contribute to this nitrate in the diet. All right, what about microbial agents? So we're going to cover two here. One of those is fecal coliforms. So this is essentially colony forming units of these microbial agents, meaning that there are little microbes in the water that can form a colony of bacteria and start to make cattle sick. And so leptospirosis, crypto, those are a couple that are spread through water supplies pretty easily and can be picked up, by us as well as cattle. And so this is really a big problem that we see in pond water because cattle get in there, they defecate, they urinate in the water, and then they hang out in there or they turn around and drink, and they can pick up that bacteria. And then, it's not long before they're all sick. And so the way that this is solved is, we have to block off or limit access to that pond. Or if it's in a tank and we have an area where cattle have been able to turn around and defecate or urinate into a tank, then we need to make sure that we clean that tank out. So this is, again, a big issue with ponds, just where cattle have been standing for time over time and then turn around and drink from that same source. And then another microbial agent that we think about is cyanobacteria. So you've probably heard this referred to as blue-green algae. And basically when there's a buildup of nutrients in the water, and so that can be nutrients from cattle waste, when there's a buildup of nutrients like that, or even from fertilizer runoff, when it combines with high temperature and limited movement. So if we're thinking about a still water source like a pond, when it's hot, those excess nutrients can cause algae to bloom. And that blue-green algae you can see pictured here. It's got that blue-green bright color. You can see it up underneath the surface there. And when cattle consume water that have this in it, it can start to affect their nervous system and their liver, and can be pretty toxic. And so if you see, muscle tremors or difficulty breathing, bloody diarrhea, some of those symptoms, and you have a pond that has this look to it, then that might be the source of the issue there that's causing some of these negative health impacts. So let's talk a little bit about how we manage water sources. So we just covered quality and what some of those parameters are that we look at, but making sure that cattle can get to water is really important. And so where we place that water is going to influence how much they take in. So we're going to talk about grazing distribution here in a second and how we set up grazing pastures or paddocks based on where our water supply is, because that water is going to be a draw for cattle. Cattle want to go to water to drink. And so if we don't set up our grazing system in a way that encourages them to move around, they're going to spend a lot of time by the water or by the shade or whatever those draws are. And so anytime we're setting up a grazing system, we have to think about placement of these different types of draws. And so I'm going to show you in the next slide how we can fence around certain water to make sure that we have an even grazing distribution and encourage intake from anywhere in our grazing system. And then just something that's a little bit different, we don't think about as much because, for our cow-calf operations, but in stocker calves, whenever stocker calves are received and put into pens, they're in an unfamiliar environment. They tend to walk the fence line or walk the edge of the pen, trying to figure out what their new environment is. And it's so important for us to get those stocker calves drinking and eating as quickly as we can so that supports their immune system and keeps them from getting sick. And so if we place water on the fence line for stocker calves, they're more likely to come across it as they walk that fence line than they would be to seek it out if it were, say, in the middle of the pen. And so, just another way that we make sure that water is accessible and it's where cattle are going to go while they're just doing kind of their general looking for feed or looking for other areas to graze. So I mentioned that, we have to set up our grazing plans, one, so that we can make sure that we utilize the whole space efficiently. So we want cattle to go into every corner or every part of our pastures. That spreads their nutrients around, that makes sure that one part of the pasture gets to recover while another one is being grazed. But the limiting factor in these grazing systems is always water, and especially in scenarios where we have a fixed water source that we can't move. And so I've got a couple of examples here. This first one, these are going to be water troughs that have been, set up in cross fencing, some of those ball waterers or tanks. And you'll notice that there's only 3 tanks there, but they've got a lot more paddocks than that. And so that's because they've set them up in a fashion where, they can get 4 paddocks grazing around 1 tank of water. So regardless of where they are, there's always access to water. So even with a limited water resource or a limited watering point, there's ways that we can split up our grazing a little bit more and still have access to those tanks. Another way that folks might do it is this wagon wheel approach. And so this could be, around if you're using a pond as a water source or even just a fixed tank, and, do a wagon wheel off of that and have access from each of those kind of pie pieces. So that could just be another option. And then finally, if you have a fixed watering source and you don't want to do that, or it's closer to the edge, I guess, it's not more centrally located, we can create an alleyway with a cross fence. So, you have cattle in one paddock, have this open to where they can come back to water here. And then once we move them here, close off this paddock on the side, but they can get to water this way. So this alleyway would function for each of these paddocks and still allow us to rotationally graze a little bit. So just some different fencing options, because we know that water is going to be our limiting factor and the place that we need to set our grazing points around. So what do the water supplies look like in our general cattle systems? Groundwater is a lot of what we use. So ponds, lakes, streams, and creeks. And it looks very different in our part of the United States compared to further out west, where their water supplies are a lot more limited. But here in the Southeast, ponds and streams are most commonly used. Those are going to be the watering sources on probably about 2/3 of our farms. And then some folks may have wells or springs and even municipal water or city water that they pump to water troughs. And so there are just some different ways that we can get water to cattle based on, what our resources are. So having a continuous supply, so not only accessible, meaning they can get to it easily from anywhere that they are in the paddock, but also that it provides continuous water. And so you need to assess the reliability and the quality of whatever your water supply is. And again, specifically thinking about this summer, we've been in a time of drought. And, if we have a pond that's pretty shallow, those ponds have kind of dried up. And I've seen a lot of that here recently, where folks have had ponds that dried up here pretty quick. And so if you do have that as a sole water source or one of your main water sources, once that pond runs dry, you have to have a backup option to supply water. And so make sure that you're thinking on that big picture scale if that's what you're relying on, because it's not going to be reliable over, year to year. When it comes to water tanks, so supplying water, through a water pipe system, make sure that you consider the capacity of that tank and those pipes. If that water is not flowing quickly or refilling tanks and it's not enough for all your cattle to get to, then that creates a risk, especially for those timid cattle that don't tend to go be the ones to stand up at the watering trough or the feed bunk first. So we know that we all have, a boss cow that gets up there first, and we've got a pecking order. And those timid cattle that tend to hang out in the back and say, well, that tank is, there's too many cows at it, I'm going to just go stand over here and not drink anything. They're going to start to have water deprivation that can eventually lead to dehydration because they're not, the ones that get up there and get water first. And so if we don't have enough tanks or we don't have enough of a supply, we create that risk. So since we're talking about those water troughs, just because we're putting clean water into them doesn't mean they're going to stay clean forever, right? So we need to make sure that if we do have a tank or a tub that we're putting water into or running water into, it's going to get algae, it's going to get slick and dirty in there. And so we want to physically clean those troughs, make sure that we dump them out, scrub them if they need to be scrubbed. And then, as a kind of a maintenance option, putting a little bit of bleach into the water supply, which can give some chlorine in the water at a safe drinking level, making sure that, we don't put too much in there. It really doesn't take a lot of bleach to disinfect water and help to control some of that bacterial growth. So not only are we trying to, keep those troughs clean by scrubbing them, but just keeping some of that chlorine in the water can help to maintain or keep that growth down. And then, like I mentioned at the beginning, water quality, all of these parameters are important because they can affect the performance of cattle in the long term. And so there was a study that looked at cow-calf pairs either having the opportunity to drink from a pond or from a trough. And they found that the calves, so nursing calves on cows who drank from the trough, had a 9% higher weight gain than calves on cows that drink from a pond. And so, I'm reading this here and I see I have a lot of typos. I apologize for that. But those nursing calves, their performance comes directly from mom's ability to lactate and provide good quality milk. And if her water intake is lower because she's got poor quality water, that's going to affect her lactation and her calf's growth. And then in the same study, they had a group of steers that were on either trough water or pond water, and steers that were drinking out of a trough demonstrated a 16 to 19% increase in weight gain. So just higher water intake probably, which leads to higher feed intake, better digestion, and then an overall increase in performance. So that was some of the quality parameters that we think about or we might measure if we're concerned about our water. But next I want to talk about the environmental concerns associated with watering points and cattle being in some of our water sources. And so, this water quality part plays into it. And this all can affect our profitability. So if we're seeing reduced animal performance from low water quality, then that's going to affect the returns that we get on those animals. But then also just the public perception of animal agriculture. And this is something that we have to think about. And that doesn't mean that we have to, completely change the way that we do things, but we have to understand that there is a perception of the way that we use land and water resources. And as cattle producers, we do a good job taking care of the land. That is, our job. And so just making sure that we're doing a good job with that. And if there are areas that we can improve, how do we go about that? So we're going to talk about erosion control, and just overall water quality of ponds and streams, and how we can maybe manage those a little bit better to make sure that cattle are getting the best water, that we're not creating any water quality concerns downstream, and that the perception of the way that we use these water resources is positive. So when it comes to letting cattle into a water source, a natural water source, a lot of times this is what we see, right? Damage to the bank, whatever the edge of that water source is, creeks and riverbanks, the edges of those streams. As cattle walk down to the water, they're going to pull some of that soil. And especially because there's not a lot of grass or plant material there, that soil is going to move underneath that hoof pressure. And it's going to not only create erosion, but also sediment loading into the water. So that sediment gets pushed down from the bank into the water source itself. And so what we see is that water source starts to get shallower, because sediment is starting to fill up that hole. And so we see that as a soil problem, but then also nutrient enrichment of the water source. Like I mentioned previously, cattle, when they get into the water, they typically tend to defecate or urinate and increase the nutrient load in that water, which is going to, in turn, cause some issues with algae and bacteria. So what are some of the benefits we see of keeping cattle out of surface water? Reduced disease and infection. So like I mentioned, that lepto and crypto, those are some of the issues that we really see with water access or pond access. And so if we can reduce that, have an overall healthier herd, cleaner water in general. So less of that nutrient load, less of that excrement in the water. If you do happen to have a waterway or a pond that has fish in it, it can help to protect that fish habitat if we keep cattle out. Reduce downstream sedimentation. So this is something that I talk a lot about with keeping a good forage canopy. If we have a dense forage canopy and we cover that soil and we have a lot of roots to pull moisture down, then that keeps our soil in place. But if we have an open canopy or a weak stand of forage, what happens when that water or that rain hits that topsoil is it pulls it with it over the top of the soil instead of pulling it down. And that moves our soil from where we want it to, the bottom of the hill or the bottom of the pasture. And so same thing here with sedimentation in a stream. If those sediments have gone into the water and then that water is flowing, then that sediment continues to move and kind of change the geography of that stream. And we want it to stay the way that it is. Not having cattle, walking down those stream banks is going to reduce erosion, reduce that bacteria load, like I mentioned, with the disease and infection, reduce nutrient loading, and then better herd health. Another thing that I haven't mentioned yet, but from a health standpoint, foot rot, cattle that have foot rot that stand in a pond, that's not going to help that foot heal or that hoof heal any better. And so that's going to be kind of a challenge when we have cattle standing in ponds. And then also, more importantly in dairy, but still in beef as well, can be some mastitis issues. with, cattle standing in water, especially if they're standing in there deep and their udders are exposed to that bacteria load, then that can create some mastitis issues as well. So let's take a look at a couple of problem areas and then the solutions to those, either by providing, an access point or a fence or something that sort of solves these little problems that we see around water points. So here's one, cattle standing in a stream. We can see here that erosion around the bank on both sides. And so if we go in and kind of fence off this area, that's going to help keep cattle out. And so the first few pictures we look at are going to be problem areas, and then we'll look at the solutions to those. Well, there we go. All right. So here's a cross area. So this is an area where cattle are crossing over from one pasture into another, and kind of same issue here, some issues with erosion and, excess nutrients getting into that area. All right, this is a stream that has a winter feeding area next to it, or a heavy use area. And so right here, if cattle have been fed in this heavy use area, there's a lot of nutrients being deposited here, not only from the hay, but also from excretion. And so because there's nothing to catch that extra nutrient runoff, then it's going to end up here in the stream. And then this is a ditch or a waterway that has formed just from erosion over time, water that has run through this pasture. And if that water continues to run and cattle, can access it, then this hole is just going to get bigger and bigger. And so this takes away from, the water source, but it also takes away from pasture as well. All right, let's see. Sorry, my computer's giving me a little bit of an issue. All right, and then the typical thing that we see here, cattle in ponds, especially, like I said, standing belly deep or deeper, their hooves are going to be affected. There's going to be excrement in that water. And so just something that we can do is, maybe we limit access instead of allowing them to have full access to the pond. This would be an example that we don't really see a lot of here in Tennessee, but if anybody has a concentrated feeding area,